Coming up, results are in from this week's round of primaries. What are the takeaways for Indian country? Plus, it's a historic trade mission for Indigenous food, and the international event has the backing of the Ag Department. And a Dakota woman writes of seasons, family, and food. Next on the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University.
Amidawa Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. We start today in New Mexico, where a tribe's ancestral land has been put into trust. Santa Ana Pueblo officially added more than 100 square miles of its ancestral lands northwest of Albuquerque. The Pueblo bought this land back in 2016, and that process finally culminated with the U.S. government last week. The 60,000-acre area that was once called Alamo Ranch will be known again by its traditional name. This action means the land cannot be sold again in the future, and it will prevent future development on the land as well as preserve culturally significant sites. These were original hunting and farming grounds for the Thamaya people, which can now continue to be used to hunt and source materials for pottery. A federal judge has ordered a railway to pay nearly $400 million to the Swinomish tribe for derailing trains carrying crude oil across its reservation. In 2023, BNSF Railway derailed 2 trains in Washington state, leaking more than 3,000 gallons of diesel fuel. The judge found the company had intentionally trespassed by repeatedly running 100 trains carrying crude oil across its reservation. While the Swinomish had an agreement to allow BNSF to run trains as long as the nature and identity of all cargo was known, the railway company's track usage increased and lacked consent. The 4-day trial that took place earlier this June was used to provide details and expert testimony to calculate how much ill-gotten profit BNSF received from their illegal trespassing and how much they should pay in retribution. In Canada, the Manitoba government has set up a plan to search a landfill for the remains of at least 2 First Nations women killed by confessed serial killer Jeremy Skibiki. The province issued a search bulletin for the Prairie Green landfill located north of Winnipeg under the Environment Act. Premier Wab Kinew laid out a 5-stage search plan, stating waste material at the landfill will start being removed this month. The plan includes hiring workforce, conducting various search operations, and targeting key areas of the landfill to find the women. Eight states with Indigenous candidates have had a primary election this month. There were nearly 70 Indigenous candidates who ran for seats ranging from school boards all the way to the U.S. Congress. Here to give us an update on those candidates is ICT political correspondent Pauly Denetclaw. Hello to you, Pauly.
Thank you for having me.
Oklahoma is fresh off of its primary, so tell us about the big races there.
So the big race is Congressman Tom Cole, who is the longest serving Indigenous member of Congress, who is seeking his 12th term in Congress. And the big question in that race was whether or not a wealthy Texas businessman, Paul Bondar, who spent over $4 million on a campaign against Tom Cole, would force the race into a runoff. And in Oklahoma, if you don't secure over 50% of the votes, then you do have to go to a runoff. And so that was the question on Tuesday. And the answer is Tom Cole won over 60% of the votes, as he normally does in District 4. And Paul Bondar got 25% of the votes, which is normally what happens in past races as well. And so the other big race was Josh Burkeen, who won over 70% of the votes. And both of these Indigenous Congress members are likely to again secure another term in Congress. And on the state legislature side, there were 18 Indigenous candidates, and 3 of them actually outright won. They had no opponents in their primary, and at the general election, they also wouldn't have any uh, opposing any opponents in those races, and so they outright won those seats.
You know, Pauly, Representative Tom Cole's win is especially notable because, as you've talked on Indige politics, his opponent was raising some pretty big dollars to go up against him. So that's notable. Tom Cole has won his primary and will head to the general election. I want to head over to North Dakota and Nevada, where last week it also had its primary election. What were the results for Indigenous candidates there?
So one of the things that I love about the North Dakota races is that in District 9 and District 4A, there are Indigenous candidates on the Democratic and Republican side who are running against each other. So there are 2 Democratic Indigenous candidates and 2 Republican Indigenous candidates who are running for District 9 in North Dakota against each other. And there's also Lisa Finley DeVille, who is an incumbent for District 4A, which largely encompasses Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara lands. And she is being challenged by another MHA citizen who is a Republican candidate. And so on the House side, each of the seats that are up that have Indigenous candidates have both a Democrat and a Republican candidates, and all of them are headed to the general election this fall. And so it won't be decided here at the primary, but it will definitely be decided in the general election. And there's one state senator, who is running for his seat. He previously held that seat for many years, but did not win in 2022 and is now coming back again in 2024 to run for that seat. And so that is North Dakota. And in Nevada, both of the Indigenous candidates, who are both Democrats, had no challengers in their races, and so are headed to the general election.
Pauly, you've been busy covering elections pretty much for the whole month of June. In one of your stories, you actually called June 4th Indigenous Super Tuesday, which I think is really clever. Tell us why that is.
So on June 4th, there were 40 candidates from 4 different states. And in June in general, there's a huge number of primary elections that have Indigenous candidates. Nearly half of the Indigenous candidates who are running this cycle have a primary election in June. And on June 4th in particular, there was a high number of Indigenous candidates who are running, and we won't see those numbers again until August. And so when Hawaii has their primary election, which again has a huge number of Native Hawaiian candidates. And so we won't see 40 Indigenous candidates running again until August. But on June, that's why I called it Indigenous Super Tuesday, was because it's the first huge number of Indigenous candidates who run on a single day. And it was really exciting. New Mexico was one of them. And it's just wonderful to see how these candidates do.
All of this data on candidates comes from ICT's 2024 Indigenous Candidates database. Tell us how the numbers have changed from 2 years ago.
So the database that ICT has is in collaboration with Advanced Native Political Leadership. And back in 2022, we were able to track over 140 Indigenous candidates. And largely, I was in charge of collecting that information and managing that database. And now in 2024, we have been able to increase the number of candidates that we are following, thanks to the collaboration with Advanced Native Political Leadership. And we have tracked over 170 candidates this election cycle. And again, in 2020, there were around 100 candidates that ICT had tracked. And so every single year, that number seems to increase. And it's really great that we're able to track even smaller races too at the city level. So school boards, city councils. And having that information is just so informative about the representation of Indigenous candidates.
And of course, ICT is always looking to expand the number of Indigenous candidates, and we know that so many Indigenous people watch our newscast. So in case there's some that we may have forgotten, you can probably reach out to Pauly and hopefully get that database up to date. Pauly, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Indigenous peoples are tied to place and language. A new book out from the University of Minnesota Press documents a Dakota woman's relationship to land and food. Perennial Ceremony is Teresa Peterson's new book, and ICT Shirley Sneve has this interview.
Well, it's a dive into a ceremonial life in the garden, and it's divided by seasons or organized by seasons. And in essence, it's how I view gardening in a ceremonial way, and all of the attributes and concepts that go into ceremony. I really have found them in gardening as well. So whether you're Christian, practicing traditional practices within our Indigenous communities, I just thought about all those concepts that go into a ceremony and found them in our way of life, really, here in gardening and foraging and harvesting and caring for the land and feeding friends and family. I live on the bluff of the Minnesota Wakwa, the Minnesota River. So a bluff, beautiful landscape. It's prairie grasses, working to restore some of that, because we're amongst a lot of farmland of corn and soybeans as well. And then riverside, we have a creek, one of the creeks that flow into the river right below the bottom of our land. And it's a lot of clay soil. So we're just learning to, this last fall, we actually planted a bunch of prairie grasses and flowers, and we're gonna start seeing those come up now. And some other plants that we planted that are supposed to be here. And so restoring land, and it's I was just really tickled when I saw that the prairie bushes and trees came up, even though like it looked like the deer ate them down, they all came back. And again, I think like when we work in harmony with what is supposed to be, I think things come a little more naturally.
So you're Sisseton Wahpeton. Did you grow up there?
No, I didn't. Actually, I talk a lot about my childhood in my earlier book, Voices from Pajuhu to ZZ, where I grew up. My mom was part of Indian relocation, ended up, she has a whole story, but anyway, she married a full-blood German. So I grew up in central Minnesota amongst, I would say, void of Dakota people.
However, you were connected to the land.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
in that way, you did grow up traditionally, so to speak.
My dad, the German, he recently passed away, but his love. So we were in the suburban area outside of the Twin Cities, and he just longed to grow up or spend more time where he grew up on the farm. And so he left a really nice paying job. We left a new house and moved out to a really old farm place where he raised primarily hogs, small time farmer. We always had a garden. I mean, Dad would let me, like when I got older, grow a whole batch of sweet corn and sell it on the side of the road. Things like that. I grew up with canning. We butchered chickens. Yeah, so all of that was really grounded in me, and that way of life and the way that you eat and bring people together was really rooted in the way that I grew up.
Your book is arranged in the cycle of life, basically.
Mhm.
And with every cycle, you have recipes that you want to share through this book. How did you select these recipes?
Honestly, the way that I cook, I think like we're picking a lot of asparagus right now. So last night or yesterday, I was like, okay, what could I make with asparagus? So then I just put together like a stir fry and we have garlic scapes, sometimes just some little ends left, and because I make stuff with that as well. But it really is grounded in what we grow, what's available in the season. And so then I just started thinking like, what do we typically, what are the meals that I prepare during these certain time of the year? So like, of course, in the winter, I do a lot of soups. So you'll find a lot of soups in the Waniatu section of the book. People know me as a big bean grower. I love growing beans. I think they're beautiful. And then I read all about how like amazing they are. If everybody ate beans every day, we'd all like eliminate all the health issues. And so I have a big array of beans on my counter, and I'm growing them again this year. And I have my favorites I grow. And yeah, I find so much pleasure in starting something from a tiny seed and then to, nurturing it, harvesting it, and then feeding friends and family. So there's just that whole cycle of that is just to me really beautiful and a good way of living. Like it feels good. Beans are actually one of the easiest things to grow. If somebody said, what should I start with? I'd say beans, because you plant them and you leave them until they're dried on the on the plant, and then you harvest your pods and you could sit in front of the TV and shell them, and then you just dry them a little bit, make sure they're dried really well so they don't mold, and then you just store them in jars or wherever. So they're just like the easiest thing to grow. There's not very little you have to do with them.
One of the people that you talk a lot about in the book is your father.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Shirley. It's we knew it was coming, and spent time in hospice, and even I was his primary caregiver, and I'll just have to say again, like one of the points of this book is how much the earth and gardening can provide you, not just like with good food, but really nourish and support, heal our own spirit and our, yeah, all of that. So in between taking care of my dad, I would go to the garden, and that would like kind of replenish me to go back and then care for him. And then I find a lot of comfort in going out there now, especially like asparagus was my dad's food. And so just lots of memories there. And it'll be like that throughout the whole season. I'll have lots of connection and memories. And I was talking to one of my sons who's engaged, and I said, I can't wait to have grandkids. But this cycle, they have interest in wanting to maintain the garden and do these things together. So I have a lot to look forward to as our family continues on.
We are all children born of water. It is where all life begins. Water embraces and protects us. We revere it in our homes. We need to live close to water. It nourishes and cleanses us. All living things know this. Sometimes water is gentle and floats in the air. Sometimes water is harsh and powerful. Sometimes it catches the sun's rays. Water changes with the seasons, alive and always moving, even when no one is looking. Water is patient. Water endures. Water brings clarity. Water purifies our thoughts. Water brings us together. Water is holy. Water helps us heal. Water is medicine.
He ali'i ka aina he kawa ke kanaka. He ali'i ka aina he kawa ke kanaka. The land is chief, man is her servant. He ali'i ka aina he kawa ke kanaka. Our land is both a responsibility and a privilege.
The first ever international trade mission focusing on Indigenous products is this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is bringing hundreds of Indigenous foods to market. Our Stuart Huntington caught up with Alexis Taylor, the department's Undersecretary for Trade from Vancouver, Canada, to check on this historic event.
Undersecretary Taylor, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
This is a historic event. I wonder if you could tell me your first impressions from the first couple of days.
I think overall it's been really positive in kind of multiple areas. So we long have done trade missions at USDA. They've been a really important tool to make sure our small and mid-sized businesses, farmers, ranchers, agricultural exporters can kind of get into diverse markets. But this is the first time we've ever done one focused on our tribal communities, Indigenous producers. And I think I just met with several of the businesses who have had meetings yesterday and this morning already, and they've had really positive interactions. Several of them, this is the first time trying to export, and so they're learning a lot. And Canada's like the perfect market because of the proximity, because of tariff advantages, language. And so there's a lot of, I think, and the strong Indigenous community we have here. So we've had nation to nation engagement as well here, which I think has been really positive. And overall, I just think it's been so positive from kind of all of the aspects of understanding and learning about the Canadian market, and really making sure our programs at the Foreign Ag Service at USDA support our Indigenous producers and exporters. And we're really excited about that.
One of the goals is to strengthen ancestral trade routes that cross the 48th parallel. How are you going to make that happen?
Yes. Yeah. I'm not going to make it happen. Our tribal businesses are going to make it happen. But one of the things that we've done, we've partnered with a large grocery store chain here and worked to have the first ever promotion of Indigenous foods that they've ever showcased. And so we actually toured the grocery store. They were partnering and pairing up some of our tribal businesses, food businesses that are here this week on the trade mission with Canadian Indigenous products as well to really complement. And it was pretty exciting to see and talk to our producer or talk to our tribal exporters to see how our products can really complement Indigenous products from Canada. And really, you know, the rising tide can lift all boats here. And for example, one of the pairings, they had a Indigenous coffee maker, the only Indigenous coffee roaster in Canada, and they did a promotion with one of the tea companies from our tribal companies and from Texas, and they did them kind of side by side. Are you a coffee drinker? Are you a tea drinker? We have a lot of like sauce companies from the United States, from our tribal producers and processors, and so they would pair maybe one of our hot sauces and kind of compare it with some seasoning from a Canadian company. So I think that's one of the ways, is to get into the grocery store, to get before consumers and to show those retailers there's demand here and people are excited about it. And to some extent, people are willing to pay a premium for it because there is a value there.
You have called this mission a turning point. That's a forward-looking statement. What do you see going forward?
So I think one of the things we're really focused on at USDA, certainly with this trade mission, is listening to what our tribal communities need and want from us at USDA. And so why we're here, and we do view this as the first step in making sure our programs at the Foreign Ag Service really can support our tribal businesses, our tribal nations. I think coming out of this, we want to hear from them on what is next, on what else should we be thinking about, how else we can be supporting them. The Intertribal Ag Council is one of our FAS, we call them cooperators. So it's the industry partners who tap into our market development programming and dollars. And so we really want to sit down with them and say, what's next? What do you need? How can we take this to the next level? So I don't know the answer to that today, but what I can say is we at FAS are really interested in working towards what is next with our tribal nations and our tribal leaders to make sure we're serving their needs.
USDA has made some changes in the way it intersects with tribal communities and producers over the last couple of years, including integrating Aboriginal sources of protein into the certification and commodities programs. How do you go about institutionalizing these changes?
I appreciate that, and that's something we're very focused on. And that's really one of the things is more self-determination for our tribes, right? And that's why I don't want to say I have ideas what's next. But it's not what I think is next. It's what our tribal communities think is next and what they need next on how we can support their export. So I think it is a fundamental shift in thinking that we're trying to institute at USDA. And I think the word you use is institutionalize is absolutely the right word. That's what we're trying to do here is institutionalize how we think differently to make sure our programs can support Indian country.
Undersecretary Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Was that a native brewed coffee that you were just sipping?
It was native brewed tea.
That is a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.